sort of the Imago Dei.
Okay, we are live.
There's a real wrong and a real right.
I think everyone does know that God existed, assuming you do.
Simply because they don't want.
I think the answer is actually kind of already in the question there.
We are the Mentionables. Hello there. You're listening to The Mentionables, the most mentionable show in podcast format. I'm Joel Furchess.
I'm Adam Coleman.
And I'm Clinton Wilcox.
Today on The Mentionables, evil scientists toy with your brain. We talk about layers of explanation and how does transhumanism affect the soul. But first, we're going to bring back a feature we've been without. It's time for Love Song, Worship Song.
Is it a love song? Is it a worship song?
You all know the rules. I give you lyrics from a song, and you tell me if it's a song about God or a song someone is singing to their special someone. Ready, gentlemen?
Right.
Ready.
Okay, the first lyric. Staring into your eyes makes my heart come alive, suddenly brought to life when I met you. Reaching beyond the skies, running deep, stretching wide, perfect love realized here with you. Now this love is for real. You will never let go. Never let go. It's more than just words. Love beyond my control, out of control. Those are the lyrics. Is that a love song or a worship song?
I'm going to go with love song.
Okay.
I'm also going to go with love song.
Okay, so that song was Hillsong's Real Love. It was actually a worship song.
I can sing of your love forever.
Really?
Wow.
Okay.
Yeah,
It threw me off with the looking into your eyes part.
That's the part that threw me off too, because I'm thinking,
Hey, it's Hillsong. That's how they do.
Right. Yeah.
All right, let's see if we can go better on this next one.
All right.
Like nothing I've seen, my wildest of dreams don't come close. I've never known better than living like this. I cannot resist you. And after all this time with you by my side, I can't imagine what it'd be like on my own. I've made up my heart. This love is all I've got. And you're the only one I know worth living for. Those are the lyrics, love song or worship song?
Oh, man. I think I'm going to stick. Oh, man. I don't know. I'm off now.
Yeah, I think I'm going to go with love song for this one. I don't know the song personally, but love song is what I'm leaning toward here.
Yeah,
Okay.
I'm going to do the same thing. I'm going to take the rock, paper, scissors approach. So I feel like if I missed the first time, I'll just stick it out, and this, my chances might be better this time. So I'm going to go with love song.
Okay, so this was also Hillsong.
I can sing of your love forever.
And that was the song, Where Are You?
Songs.
Yeah, now we're going to go worship song next time because it's been two worship songs. It's going to throw us a loop for the love song.
Right. And so Hillsong is going to have a love song or something like that on the next one. It's going to be all jacked up.
Yeah.
All right, so this is the last one.
Oh, man.
All right. Can I go where you go? Can we always be this close forever and ever? And take me out and take me home forever and ever. You're my lover. Ladies and gentlemen, will you please stand with every guitar string scar in my hand? I take this magnetic force to be my lover. That's the
I'm going to go love song, man. I'm going to, because if it's not, it's kind of a weird worship song. I don't even want to say that, but so I'm just going to go with love song, man.
All right.
Yeah, I'm going to go love song also.
Okay, and you were both correct. That is the song Lover by Taylor Swift.
Oh, gotcha. Okay.
And that's it for Love Song, Worship Song.
Right. Man, thrown off by Hillsong.
Right.
Yeah, well, I don't know, but those are probably the only two songs they've ever written that sound like a pop love song. Sure, everything is solid theology from there out.
Oh snap! Shots fired.
Right.
That's actually the entire point of the game.
Some jabs. I got you. I got you.
Right.
All right, so the meat of our content today, we're going to be talking about the concept of the self. I'm not sure how to make this one sound light and fun. It is what it is. We have to figure out what we mean when we talk about ourself. This is a little like trying to nail down the definition of beauty or love. You sort of know what it is when you experience, but defining it to others becomes pretty difficult. I'm going to explore this from a cultural, historical, and psychological perspective, and then I'm hoping Adam can jump in and help us look at this from a Christian perspective in a part 2 episode to follow this one. Cool, Adam?
Yeah, sounds good to me, man. Sounds like a lot of fun.
All right. So before I roll up my sleeves and we wade into this thing, to mix a metaphor, Clinton, do you want to hit me with a quick off the top of your head definition of self?
Sure.
Okay.
I guess if I were to give just a quick down and dirty definition of the self, it would be the I being in quotation marks, that is the locus of all of my personal experiences and undergirds all of my potentialities and retains my identity through each of my changes and through each of my waking and sleeping moments.
Okay, I like that. That's going to touch on some of the things we're going to discuss. I mean, just look at the question. I think, well, I'm me, right? I'm the guy looking out from behind my eyeballs. Myself is the guy sitting in the office talking. So I occupy space in this spot and I perform actions. Or like the t-shirt says, that's what I do. I read books and I know things. It's a combination of actions and states of being. But let's try a thought experiment. This isn't my original thought experiment. It's one I lifted from a similar discussion, but it helps to put the question in perspective. So this is kind of a heavy one. So I want you guys to prepare yourself for this one. Ready?
Okay.
All right. So imagine an evil scientist captures you, Clinton and Adam. He takes you to his lab and straps you down and connects your brains to a computer. The computer records all of the memories, feelings, and thoughts of Adam and puts them in Clinton's brain and does the reverse to Clinton. And here's the thing. He erases your existing memories as he does so. So at the end of the experiment, Clinton is left with only Adam's memories and thoughts, and Adam is left with only Clinton's. So before he conducts the experiment, the scientist asks you to make a decision. At the end of the experiment, he's going to give one body $1 billion, and he'll torture the other body. He asks you to choose, should he give the money to your current body or the body that contains your memories and thoughts? And which one should he apply the pain to? So think about it this way. When Adam's body has Clinton's memory and it comes walking out of the lab, everyone's going to continue to call him Adam. His wife and kids will continue to love him as if he were their husband and father. The world will see him as Adam. And if Adam starts talking and acting like Clinton, they're going to say, well, clearly this is Clinton now. No, they're going to say that this continues to be Adam, but something is wrong with him. He's acting like Clinton, but they won't say he is Clinton. Adam's social self, if you will, remains the same. But what about his personal self? Clinton has the exact same brain he had before. The organ sitting between his ears hasn't changed its substance. He has the same genetic makeup, physical skills, and strength. What has changed is the content and possible configuration of his brain. So he might actually think of himself as being Adam in the body of Clinton. And if ourselves are the sum of our memories and experience, then Clinton really is Adam at this point. So that's the thought experiment to illustrate the dilemma. What do you think, gentlemen?
No, it's really fascinating, and it draws me to Richard Swinburne's work. When I think about some of the arguments that he's made for the soul, he's kind of got these. I want to say it's his most recent book where he kind of walks through a similar thought experiment, and he demonstrates that you probably do need something more than just like say the mental content and dispositions of a person to really get at, that person ontologically. So, first of all, I think it'd be pretty scary to wake up one day and I'm just in somebody else's body. I can't I can't imagine what that would be like. But then just the way that I even phrase that, when you think about it, if I were to wake up in someone else's body, I've already made some differentiation between the body and the self,
Mm-hmm.
And I think that distinction, the drawing a line between the self and the physical body, I think that's something that's pretty intuitive. I think our deepest intuitions point us that way. And I think that, upon further reflection, I think that we've got good grounds to see there being a difference between the two. But ultimately, yeah, I would say that, who I am is something different than just the sum total of thoughts and things that I think about me. It's that mental activity.
Yeah. And this is sort of, Clinton, the kind of transhumanism idea that, if I can just record my thoughts and memories into a computer, then I continue to live after I die in that computer. But there seems something a little off about that, right?
Yeah, that's a pretty wild assumption, and not one that we should actually place our hopes and dreams for the future in.
Yeah.
Because if there's no such thing as a soul, and all a person is just the sum total of their experiences and memories and that kind of thing, then then there's nothing really undergirding a person to keep their identity the same. Because like if you lose all of your memories, then you've essentially just died. If you're in a terrible car accident and you lose all of your memories to where you have to even learn how to walk and talk again, the previous person occupying your body has basically just died, and a new person has arisen in your body, essentially. So if you're only just the sum total of your experiences and memories, if you upload that to a computer, some kind of a computeristic mind or something like that, then who's to say that will actually be you after the transfer, and not that they just killed you and now the artificial intelligence believes himself to be the person just uploaded his intelligence into the computer, but isn't actually the original copy. I don't know how anyone who doesn't believe in a soul could actually be that confident that they themselves will be uploaded, and not just their memories and experiences, to where the computerized brain or whatever will just believe himself to be the original, but will in fact be a numerically different individual.
And interestingly enough, just kind of come back on that, Clinton. I wonder if we do take this idea of like transhumanism seriously, I wonder if in doing so you've already taken a step away from naturalism, right? If you're really saying that I am whatever it is being uploaded to a disk or C-3PO or whatever robot I end up inhabiting or something like that, right?
You had to choose C-3PO of all the robots out there.
Right. Right. That's the first one that came to mind. I was watching that Boba Fett, so that's the first thing that popped in my head, But it seems to me that you're giving some real ontological weight to information at that point, if we're going to take that seriously. And I think that to square information into what we might call the natural realm, and by natural I'm referring to the physical, what I'm saying, some sort of physicalism. But nevertheless, I feel like you've taken a step. The person would have to take a step away from naturalism at that point, because you're appealing to something that can't be grounded in physics and chemistry or the pushes and pulls thereof. You see what I'm saying?
Right.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a good thought. All right, so let's get into the history of this. So the first people, like historically, it's a little suspicious that everyone seems to think about them being an individual, a self, without ever being taught that, right? So it's universal, and throughout history, almost every culture has this idea of a sort of immaterial self, a soul or a spirit, which exists as a separate entity from the body, meaning that if I lose an arm, I am still the same person I was before. I'm not identical to my body. There's a me-ness that remains the same whether my body changes or not. in addition to coming up with this idea that looks like a soul, each culture also has the idea of a soul continuing on in some form after death. And I'm pulling this from research. I'm not just assuming that. They've done studies, and pretty much every country and culture they've been able to get information on has some idea. Like, a ghost, your soul continues on Earth as sort of an immaterial form, or you're reborn into a new body with sort of a reincarnation idea. Or maybe it goes to some afterlife. I mean, we can see that as early as in ancient Egypt or in sort of Greece and Rome cultures thinking about an afterlife. But it continues whichever way it goes. And so we'll probably be revisiting the idea of a soul later in the discussion. But before we go on, any thoughts of this universal conclusion of soulness that we see throughout the world and across history?
No, I just find it interesting. I think that I guess one thing I would say is I feel like the pressure of modernity, or at least in higher academia anyway, is to think of this idea of being a soul or whatever is like foolish and mystical and something to be just pushed aside by rational people today. But to me, I take some comfort in the idea that for the vast majority of human history, people have taken it as kind of basic, that they are indeed a soul, and I feel as though we don't have to engage in some sort of what's the word I'm looking for? I guess kind of chronological snobbery, like just because we're in 2020,
right?
To like all of a sudden, we got to just everybody else before us was dumb. No, I think it's it may not be intellectually respectable amongst like the la-di-das of today, but I think people, the average person has good grounds, to be in step with the vast majority of human history. There's something like I mentioned before. There's something intuitive about the idea that I'm a soul, and not just a physical body, physical person.
Yeah. So, I mean, just because it's an old idea doesn't mean it's a bad idea.
Right.
Yeah, I think murder is still a bad idea. I think murder is still wrong. And I'm sure for eons before me, people have thought that. I think that they were probably right.
Yeah.
Yeah. All right. So the first person who really began to look at the other definitions of selfhood outside of some kind of spiritual essence was probably the philosopher Hume, who said that our self is just the center of our physical perceptions. Like, who am I? I'm the perceiver of the world around me. Whenever my hearing and seeing and feeling things meet one another at some kind of locus, that's myself. I'm just a bundle of perceptions. What do we think about Hume?
Well, I wonder if we can kind of co-opt him, kind of in light of, modern research. As I understand it, we've done a good bit to kind of map the brain as far as neuroscience and whatnot. And when we think about, just the different aspects of the human experience, I'm just talking about this in the physical realm. So for example, if I'm looking at an apple, I perceive redness, I perceive roundness, I perceive, maybe whatever distance it is from me. I mean, there's no part of the physical brain that centralizes all of those different aspects of that experience. Nevertheless, there must be something, that allows me to harmonize and make a coherent experience out of seeing that apple. And given that, it seems to me, as I understand it, we haven't been able to locate that in the physical brain. I think Hume is maybe pointing to something that we can say, okay, well, whatever self he was talking about, it's not physical. It needs to lie, somewhere beyond what we see going on in these neurons that we've got.
Yeah, no, that's a good point. And something that's always struck me about this, and, this ties in somewhat to my idea of free will and determinism, which we'll talk about a little bit more later, is that there's always a part of us who's able to reflect on whatever we're doing or thinking. So I'm not just looking and perceiving this apple, I'm reflecting on myself perceiving the apple. I can think about what I'm doing and kind of take that step back and see myself from that sort of third person perspective as well. And, you see this yourself. You do something impulsive or, you do something and you immediately start regretting it and you start reflecting on that activity that you take as if you were not the one taking it, but you're watching yourself take the action. So So this ability to reflect on our thoughts is, what do they call that? Metacognition.
Yeah, it's like if me and my wife are in a disagreement, and I'm saying something stupid. 90% of the time, as it's coming out of my mouth, I know I'm saying something stupid. That I'm going to regret later, and I'm cringing as I say it, but then I say it anyway. So I'm definitely reflecting on, I guess, a metacognition in that instance. Yeah.
Yeah, and it's like this idea of solipsism, that like I'm the only one around, or I'm a brain in the vat or whatever. So these things are going on, and I'm still learning new things. I'm still surprised at events that are occurring. I don't have the sort of omniscience as if I were the only one around. There is some part of me that's telling the story to myself that knows what's something that I don't know, and is bringing new information into the sphere. And that's what makes sort of the brain in the vat and solipsism iffy to me, because if you're the only one around, why is there so much that surprises you and that you don't know?
Yeah, that's good.
Right. Yeah, actually, I was watching. I forget what it was, but it was actually Matt Dillahunty, who is not very. A lot of people don't really think him to be a highly intellectual person, but he actually had what I thought was actually a pretty compelling reason as to why he doesn't believe solipsism is correct, because that would basically make him a genius because of all the things he's learned from people like Stephen Hawking and Albert Einstein and incredibly intelligent people. That would basically make him a genius. And he knows that his intelligence is not up to par with the scientific geniuses of Hawking and Einstein and folks like that. So I thought that was actually a pretty compelling reason to me why we shouldn't be solipsists.
Yeah, you're essentially creating new information out of thin air.
Yeah, which that's a good point. That's a good point. I'm only a solipsist on Sunday afternoon. And then when I'm trying to watch the football game and my kids are interrupting me and I want to lock in, I just know you're all projections. I don't have to change that diaper right now. Right. You're just a projection.
Convenient. All right, so that was Hume. Along the same lines as David Hume, the father of behavioral psychology, B.F. Skinner, decided that the self was the point at which all of your behaviors overlap and interact with one another. And I mean, he's a behaviorist, so of course he put it in terms of behavior. So Skinner says that you're a combination of three things. The first being your biological history, sort of the evolution and genetics that make you, and the history that led up to your current genetic and evolutionary status. And the second being your cultural history. So that's like the social soup into which you're born, which defines how your parents are going to raise you and how society is going to see you and the values that will be passed down to you and the stories that you're told and so forth. And then the final thing is your personal history or experiences, those things you learn to desire and avoid. All of the things that I just mentioned, these three things come together to determine how you behave in given circumstances and put together these so-called fields of behavior are what overlap to make you you. So it feels like Skinner put a little more work and thought into it than Hume did, but their conclusions are pretty similar in a lot of ways. What do you think?
Well, did Skinner come after Hume?
Yes, I believe so.
Okay, because I don't know. I haven't studied much psychology. I took an intro to psychology class in college, but I would just imagine, Hume was just probably one of the thinkers that Skinner, read and studied and may have based his work on and tried to, not necessarily incorporate it, but improve upon it. I would say so. Yeah, so it probably shouldn't be that surprising that there are some similarities there. Yeah.
Yeah, what I'm saying, though, is that Hume just kind of boiled it down to kind of, there's not much difference between me and a starfish, whatever I'm able to perceive. Maybe I've got a more sophisticated nervous system, so I've got more meanness than a starfish does. But Skinner would have gone the opposite direction. He would say that, essentially a starfish and I are the same. It's just that we can map out a history of behavior, that differentiates me and how I act to what a starfish does.
Oh, yeah. I don't know. Oh, go ahead.
No, I was going to say it was interesting is that I think that this is actually something I've been studying a little bit about over the last year or so, because both sociology and psychology, you have different schools of thought about like what constitutes, the self concept, how kind of like the big picture of how we see ourselves. And, maybe we can come back to this in a little while. But one of the things I find interesting is that in either, essentially you have social identity theory, which sociologists kind of have their way of looking at how identity is constructed. And then you have identity theory, which is how the psychologists look at it. And what's interesting in either case, the self is not looked at as being like a inactive, or I'll just say it as an entirely passive blank slate. So whereas, they may take into account history, whether it be biological, cultural, so on and so forth, you still have to ask the question, like, what is that blank slate? Like, what is that chalkboard, that internal chalkboard that's being written upon? And it is who's doing the writing? Is it entirely external? And it seems to me that whoever's doing the writing is not entirely external. So for example, I use this example. I was on live with Tim Stratton a while back, and I was saying, if I go out for the basketball team and I never make a shot, I don't get a rebound, like nothing. I'm just stinking it up entirely, and I come away from that experience thinking like, man, I'm a horrible basketball player. Right. Like who's done the writing, in that personal experience, like who's done the writing on my blank slate about what kind of basketball player I am and where was it written in a sense. Right. So I said that to say, in any given social situation, in our personal experience, it seems like there's more to that blank slate than just some sort of, passive thing to be written upon. There's more going on there, because I might come away from that experience and say, well, I'm not a bad basketball player. I just had a bad day. That might be something that I write upon my blank slate. Now, who's the determinant between the second message that's written or the first? I'm a bad basketball player versus I'm not bad, I just had a bad day. Who's determining which one of those messages gets written on the blank slate of my self-concept, right? It seems to me that that's not something that's entirely external. There's some internal piece there, which then leads us to a self of some sort. That's doing the writing and being written upon by these personal experiences, social interactions and so on and so forth, and bringing to the table into those at least some of those social interactions, for example, a sense of self that has to be accounted for, I think.
Yeah, so I like that example. It brings up a lot of things. One of those being that your standard person who goes out and does that at the basketball court, they're going out with the intention of winning. They shoot the basket with the intention of making the basket. When it doesn't hit, they don't blame themselves for that not hitting because their intention was for it to hit and it went against their intention. So obviously it didn't work out the way I wanted it to. Therefore, it's got to be something external to myself to blame for the failure. And that's just kind of how human beings operate. We blame things outside of ourselves for failure because we don't set out with the intention to fail. So this is just kind of how human beings operate. But in cognitive psychology, they've got this concept called self-regulation. And in self-regulation, you would be like, okay, I intended to shoot the basket. I didn't hit the basket, but the failure to hit the basket was something that originated here. I got to figure out what it was that I did and do it differently so that my intentions succeed next time.
Yeah, I was kind of thinking that same thing because I was thinking, yeah, you can blame something else if you miss the basket, but there are things you could have done incorrectly to where you would be to blame for missing that shot. Maybe you didn't adequately maybe you didn't adequately judge the distance before you shot. You just took a wild shot or something. So there could be things that you do which led to you not making that shot. So it seems like self-reflection might be in order too, just to determine whether or not it was something you did or whether or not it was something external to you that was outside of your control.
Yeah, and that actually really ties back into this discussion because there is a me that had every intention of hitting that basket. This me that I'm dissociating from my body and the circumstances surrounding didn't get what it wanted. And so there's something external to the me, the sort of essential self that had the intention of hitting that basket that was responsible for not hitting that basket. And it's kind of hard to take that back on yourself because you're so disconnected from even your body that's, flubbing up the shots that you consider yourself separate from even that. So it's just kind of an interesting way in which we intuit ourselves apart from circumstances.
Oh, very true. Yeah.
All right, so I believe we just went over Skinner. Skinner and behaviorism is kind of passe. They don't, psychology sort of drifted away from that, and the way that psychology is going now is cognitive psychology. So the question is, what does cognitive psychology say about the self? Honestly, they have no idea. We know there must be some kind of locus of selfhood that explain things like self-control, self-esteem, self-consciousness, and all of these things we talk about in cognitive psychology. So like if you come into the psychologist and you say, everybody hates me, and the psychologist would say, all right, so what you're thinking there probably isn't true in reality. Let's step back from that and examine that thought, and they would go on. Well, the fact that there is a me for other people to hate and there's a me to make mistakes is assumed by the cognitive psychologist as they're going through that process. So, this idea of a self is assumed in psychology, even if they're not willing to admit it. There's a couple of researchers, one of which is named Thagard, who documented about 80 different artifacts of cognition that pointed to a self, but couldn't tell you what generated those cognitions. Now, yeah, go ahead.
Throughout all this time where you have these different schools of thought with psychologists, are there any Christians who are doing psychology that can approach these ideas like behaviorism or Hume's ideas, these kinds of things, either approach them from a Christian perspective or critique them from a Christian perspective while these other psychologists are doing work?
Yes, there absolutely are. And the deal is that either the Christian psychologist has to couch their research in terms which dissociate from Christianity, or they have to publish exclusively in Christian research journals, because they're not really allowed to float their Christian research with reference to things like the soul and God and so forth to your popular. Yeah, go ahead.
Because I was just going to say, if psychology that moved on from Skinner, couldn't tell you what the self is. Well, certainly there were Christian psychologists, I'm sure, who could tell you what the self is, and it seems awfully limiting to prevent Christians from being able to express psychology from a Christian perspective. If psychologists have no idea what the self is, well, maybe Christianity has insight that they could offer to psychologists, and psychologists seem to not even be willing to consider that others, religious schools of thought might have something of value to offer when they don't have, any sort of answers toward, these kinds of things that they study, like the self.
Well, see,
it's very interesting because so my background, I have a mental health background as well. I'm a social worker by trade, and what you brought up is exactly right, Clinton, because I know there's been times in I kind of just chuckle to myself, when sometimes when we're staffing a case or whatever, because you hear therapists throw around words and concepts that there's no way you can ground it, in my opinion. I would argue you can't ground it, in natural terms, but yet they would shun any talk of spirituality or anything beyond the natural. Knowing these individuals, they would balk at that. And then they go on to talk about ethics, and then they go on to talk about, the self, morality, and all these different things. I'm like, man, these are great metaphysical, ideas, and need some grounding here.
Right.
But they just, are not willing to go there. And I find that fascinating. So to your point, we have what's called cognitive behavioral therapy, and it really hinges upon the reality. I mean, this is born out of the sciences of neuroplasticity, the fact that your physical brain is not fixed. I mean, it can definitely change, and neurons can create new pathways that essentially amount to being able to think differently about this or that. I mean, this is a very real thing. Like, your brain can physically change to adapt, whether positively, to say maybe positive self-talk or something like that, or negatively, in response to trauma or something like that. Your physical brain can change. And that being said, we know that we can engage in self-talk and change our own brains, which seems, I think, fits very well, I'll put it that way, in a mode where you have some sort of dualistic relationship between the self and the physical brain. That makes a lot of sense to me, But again, talking about these kind of things, I think in the field can be really difficult. And like Joe pointed out, I'm not at all surprised that people who are trying to publish along those lines would run into a great deal of difficulty.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I mean, the psychologists have an escape hatch when it comes to that, because ultimately in academic psychology, you really only have to do two things. You have to describe behavior, like, okay, when A happens, B result follows. If a person is a psychopath, they will act in such and such a way in this situation based on research. So you describe behavior. Describing it doesn't necessarily mean that we get into the works and find out what the hamster in the wheel is that's driving those behaviors. We can just say that A happens and therefore B results. And then the other is to develop interventions, like what can we do to help shape behaviors and help people, with positive self-talk and things like that. We design an intervention that works, and we don't necessarily need to lean back on any kind of spirituality for that. We develop sort of interventions and therapies and so forth. Now, a Christian therapist might, talk about, hey, let's explore gratitude to God. Let's explore prayer. Whereas a non-Christian psychologist would put those same things in. Well, let's just explore gratitude in general. I'm thankful for what? Yeah. List the things you're thankful for. Or, they'll say, instead of prayer, they might say reflection or meditation or something like that. So, yeah, I mean, the interventions look very similar, but the idea behind them. And then when it comes to identifying the self, a psychologist can say, well, that's a philosophical thing. We don't need to deal with that in psychology. All we need to do is describe and then intervene.
Yeah. So too, the sociologists and the neuroscientists, are very similar. They can make observations, predictions, and say, okay, well, when this happens, then we can predict that that'll happen. But like you said, Joel, that ultimately these questions, I think, lend themselves to a deeper philosophical reflection, and so, dealing with the hard sciences and soft sciences like psychology, like sociology, ultimately they're going to have to get back to, something of a more metaphysical discussion to give some sort of underpinning to the observations that they're making. But that may just be out of the realm of what they're interested in,
Yeah. And so, I'm more well-versed in philosophy than I am in psychology. And when you were talking about how, for example, Skinner would say that we're essentially no different from a starfish, in that we have, a locus of our experiences and that kind of thing. Well, philosopher Mortimer Adler, who was a 20th century philosopher, would say there's a huge difference between myself and a starfish, or even more complex animals like dogs and cats and that kind of thing. And it's something that you actually touched on earlier, Joel, is the fact that we do have what we might call these second order thoughts and desires, where I don't just think that I want an apple, but I can think about me wanting an apple, or I can have these second order desires where I don't just, like, I could desire to go out and have a slice of pizza, but I can also have second order desires, or I have desires about my desires. Well, pizza isn't exactly very healthy. Maybe I should have a salad instead. So these what we would call second order thoughts and desires are what would place us over and above animals like starfish and that kind of thing. So I was thinking, I don't know, maybe that's just the realm of philosophy. Is that not something that psychology would really go in depth about? Or
so when it comes to like reflecting on thoughts, there is a thing called metacognition that psychologists talk about sometimes. But even if they don't, that's sort of what is second order thoughts?
Yeah, like thoughts about thoughts, second order thoughts and desires and things like that.
So that's more or less assumed because, like, for instance, Adam was talking about this self-talk, like, so that you would tell this person, all right, step back and reflect on what you're saying to yourself. The things that you're saying to yourself, would they result in good results or bad results? And so now you're reflecting on your own behaviors. And then the cognitive behavioral therapist would tell you, all right, now that we can reflect on our own behaviors, let's change those behaviors. So there's another you above the you that's behaving that then directs that behavior. And that's assumed that, they don't even think, well,
Yeah.
how is that possible? How is there this third me that's looking at my behaviors?
Right.
No, it's just like, it's a thing that we know we can do. And so do it.
Yeah. So it's just kind of their attempt at an explanation for why we do these things, or
I don't think they even attempt that's an intervention
Oh.
right there. What we're talking about is an intervention to help change these behaviors for the better.
Yeah.
And they don't have to explain why it works, just
yeah,
demonstrate
just
that
or-
it works.
Yeah. Okay. Gotcha.
But okay, so in cognitive psychology, we've got a guy named Thagard. He's the guy that documented 80 different artifacts of the self. And Thagard takes a levels of explanation view. All right, so levels of explanation. This is a concept, you can tackle it from a variety of angles. And with the levels of explanation, it says, okay, we've got this concept, let's say love. Now, if I asked a poet and a linguist and a psychologist and Taylor Swift and a theologian to tell me what love means, I'm going to get 5 different answers. And the levels of explanation view would say that each of those answers, except for Taylor Swift's, of course, would work at its level. So the poet's definition of love and the theologian's definition of love both touch on something about love, but so neither of them are wrong, but they're different than each other. And so this is how Thagard approaches the idea of the self. He says that it works at the personal level. So how do I define myself? The social level, how does everyone else see me? The neural level, how's my brain wired? And the molecular level, which is essentially my genetic makeup. And put together, these levels overlap to form the self. Now we'll take a look at those 4 levels, but first it's important to talk about what makes this discussion relevant. And probably the most relevant question that this discussion hits on is the idea of free will or determinism. Meaning, do I make my own decisions, or are my decisions made for me based on my genetics and my history of experience? So without opening the entire can of worms related to free will, what do you guys think about the connection of selfhood and free will?
Well, yeah, I think that they're intricately related. I don't have to go into it all now, but I actually have a video on my channel where I go through what I call the scan argument. And essentially, it's the argument that the self concept kind of cries out for some sort of dualistic explanation, right? If it is the case that essentially everything is just matter and physically determined from one moment to the next, so you used to get some sort of a temporal determination, but then also physical states at, say, the higher level, more complex level of physical reality are essentially boiling down to what's going on at the more fundamental level, the kind of the smallest constituents of the physical universe, atoms or waves or whatever. If that's the case, then it seems to me that we don't have any I would argue that we don't have free will. Essentially, I think determinism X's that out, Now, because ultimately, what's going on in your brain is kind of like just the end of the, or the next domino falling in a series of dominoes that goes back to like the Big Bang or something like that, on the smallest level. Now, I said that to say that kind of, harkening back to something I said earlier, the self is in the social sciences, in psychology, sociology, is considered to be an active agent. It's not just like a blank slate that drifts from one social situation to another, but indeed we do bring something to the table into every social interaction. And we also, are not just written upon, but we can kind of wrestle with and have a say-so, if you will, in terms of what we adopt into our self-concept after experiencing something or engaging in some sort of social interaction. So that being said, if determinism is true and essentially we don't have free will because everything is just kind of fizzing about, in our brains and, we're not really in control of it, then kind of going back to my example earlier, I'm actually not in control of whether I determine myself to be a bad basketball player versus somebody who had a bad day. If I go out and try out for basketball and don't do well, that's actually something, that's beyond my control. It's just whatever, however the dominoes fall in the physical pieces of my brain. So that's really what it comes down to. So I think free will is essential to how we develop a self-concept. I think that when, for example, when we think about a counseling session, Joel, your background being in psychology, I think that if a woman comes into your office and she's sitting on that sofa, I don't know if that's a real thing psychologists do anymore, but let's just say that she is. She's sitting on that sofa and she says, "Man, I'm in this really abusive relationship," and you start walking her through maybe some trauma with her dad or something going on with the families, something kind of in those earlier years where there was some sort of misstep, that has framed how she sees herself, and then thereby gets into these series of bad relationships, if you will. I think that in that counseling session, you're presupposing, and rightfully so, that she can actually rightly assess her current self, who she was in the past, how it relates to today, and then she can make some determination on what to do next, right? All of those things presuppose some sort of free will. I mean, that she's able to actually, engage in that reflective process, with you, make assessments, and then make some sort of determination about what she's going to do about her situation, moving forward. I don't think that you can have any of that, without some sort of free will. And I don't think you can have free will if it is the case that the current states of our brain boil down to physical processes that are temporarily determined, by whatever happened, some sort of antecedent event, a physical event, or some sort of physical event that's at the atomic level or something like that, which is obviously beyond the control of whatever my neurons are doing. So, I think the free will is essential. I don't think that we can really get around that in terms of how we build the self-concept.
And if anybody wants to see the video on Adam's channel, the channel is True ID. That's TRU and the letters ID.
Right. True ID Apologetics. Exactly right. Yep. It's that's kind of like a snippet version of what I call the scan argument. It's the self-concept argument against naturalism, and I cite, these different aspects of the, kind of our rational, faculties, both you got free will factoring in there, but also talk about qualia and mental causation. And I'm saying that without those kind of building blocks, then the self-concept essentially falls apart. Our experience in terms of who we are would be like incoherent. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah. And it's interesting, we keep kicking it back to this idea of a self that can observe the self and reflect on the self. This higher order thinking, Clinton, is, the lady on the couch, I'm walking her through her history, and Adam says, I'm assuming, and rightfully so, that there is some part of her that can look at her past and her behaviors and make assessments, and then perhaps step in and make changes on those things too. And I mean, you could really swing this around, and I think that we will later on, to this idea of sort of sin and repentance, and possibly changing because of the repentance. I have this motto that I made up for my son with his various decisions and so forth and frustrations. And it goes like this. I say, bad things happen on accident, but good things happen on purpose. Meaning that, I could do things, or things could happen to me that I did not intend. All of these bad things happen. I didn't intend for them to happen. But if I'm going to have a good thing happen, I've got to step up and make it happen. Good things just don't fall out of the sky, usually.
That's good, man. That's good. I'm still that, give that to my kids and act as if I came up with it.
Yeah. We're going to make it a thing, you and me.
There you go.
There we go.
Yeah. Regarding the self and free will, I've met some people who actually don't believe that we have a free will, and I do think that's irrational to believe that, because the only having a free will is the only way to account for certain aspects of our experience, like the fact that we desire justice. That would be irrational if there was no such thing as a free will, because no one would be responsible for their actions. Things like that. So I can imagine if you just believe that we are purely physical things, and that all the I being in quotation marks, all the I is just a subject, or the entirety of my memories, and experiences, then I can see why someone would believe we don't actually have a free will, because in that case, all we would be, everything we do would just be a product of everything that we've gone through, all that we remember and experience. So in that case, you would not have a free will. The only way to account for the existence of a free will and for the fact that that it is right for us to desire justice and things like that is if there is something that transcends these mental experiences. So that if the person in a car accident who loses all of their memories, we would say, those of us who believe that there is an immaterial soul would say that the person did not die in that car accident. The person himself persists through the car accident, even though he lost all of his memories and has to relearn how to walk and talk and things like that. So the only way to account for our having a free will would be as if there's something to the I that transcends all of our experiences, to where because I can't remember every single moment of my life. I don't remember things that happened when I was just 1 year old. I don't remember everything that happened yesterday, but surely I was a person through all of those experiences that I had, and I was me, and I did not poof out of existence and come back into existence at the points that I can remember. So it seems like there's something immaterial that transcends all of these memories and experiences. And if there is, in that case, there's also something that can transcend all of our experiences, in the sense of we're not necessarily blinded by them, or we're not necessarily a slave to them, where the reason that I might go left instead of going right is because of certain experiences in my past. Well, I have the ability, being a rational agent and having an immaterial soul that transcends all of these things, I have the ability to weigh my decisions and say, okay, my instinct might be to go left, but I can rationalize and I can think, through reasons that might actually be better for me to go right instead of going left. Of course, that's just a mundane example off the top of my head, but there are a lot of examples we could potentially come up with to where we can transcend our experiences and reason through them, and not do what might be instinctual for us to do, but do the thing that's not instinctual. Something that's not quite a mundane thing would be, for example, giving money to a homeless person. Well, that's a detriment to us because we're giving them money that we could use for other things, but due to a sense of charitability, thinking that we might have an obligation to be charitable, or if I have the means, I should give to other people to benefit when I don't necessarily need something, even though I'm losing something by giving it to them. So there are all of these things we could talk about that are things that might not benefit us specifically, but we would do because there are certain mitigating factors which would essentially lead us to do things that we wouldn't necessarily do by instinct, or because of all of the experiences that led up to where we are now, essentially.
All right.
Hopefully that kind of makes sense. I might have rambled there a little bit, but
No, I'm with you. I mean,
yeah, okay.
All right. So the second way that this particular conversation might be relevant is the idea of reductivism and anti-reductivism. So let me explain what that means. Reductivism, as the word implies, reduces the self to a simple holistic explanation. So there's a simple, single, undifferentiated me that is not the sum of my parts. This would be the idea of a soul, right? So soul is generally seen as a single entity, which is not the sum of its parts, and it's kind of comprehensive and unchanging in nature. And this is the same sort of idea that we get when we talk about the simplicity of God, right? So, he's a single, undifferentiated being that's not the sum of his parts, but all of his attributes, his love and justice and so forth, are things that generate out of that single essence. They're, I forget the word for it. Oh, well. Yeah. All right, so that's the reductivist view. And then the anti-reductivist view would be the opposite. It would say that our self is the sum of its parts. So it's kind of like Hume's bundles of perception model, or Skinner's fields of behavior model, or even Faggard's levels of explanation view. You put a bunch of parts together, and in combination, they make up the self. So thoughts on the reductivist versus anti-reductivist view?
No, actually, I don't really have anything to say much about that. I will say though that I wonder if this the idea of the self being the kind of the sum of its parts would seem like that wouldn't jive too well with notions of divine simplicity. That's for sure. The idea that God is not made up of parts. Nevertheless, we would obviously count him as having a self, right? So one could say, I mean, but even independent from that, though, I'm not even sure if that's correct, though, because like we talked about before, I mean, I don't think that. I think the self is something distinct from the mental activities and capacities and all those kinds of things. I don't think that you can kind of Voltron it all together and make a self. It's something laying outside that.
Yeah, it depends on whether or not you're comfortable with sort of an immaterial abstract being the self or not. Because if you're not, then it's got to be the sum of its parts.
Right. Yeah. And, I don't have too much to say other than just say that I would actually argue that that's not correct. I would say the self is more than the sum of its parts, for reasons that I've already kind of expounded on,
All right. So after talking about free will and reductivism, we're ready to talk about the self as a continuum. So what does that mean? It means that the same self, I am the same self across my lifetime. Or is the 3-year-old Joel Furchess a completely different person than the current Joel Furchess? We can't really deny that we grow and learn and change and think differently over time. As we grow, we mature and we gain knowledge and experience we didn't have before. And as we get old, we begin to lose some of our mental capacity and that we once had. But similar to our evil scientist experiment, our family and friends see us as being the same person, despite the changes we undergo. And we like seeing ourselves as the same person. In fact, it's good for mental health to see ourselves as the same person across time. So one study I looked at saw that people who lose their jobs actually lose some sense of self-continuity. They think they've changed, they've become a different person, and their mental health suffers as a result. And then in the same study, they saw that people who had a very strong sense of self-continuity were better able to handle job loss. It didn't affect them as badly. So then another study along the same vein showed that when we undergo life changes that challenge our sense of self-continuity, it triggers the tendency to reminisce about the past. So we start looking at old photos. We hook up with old buddies and start talking about the past. We reminisce. And this reminiscence actually strengthens our sense of self-continuity. So whether I'm the same self now as I was as a kid, I want to see myself that way. And it's healthier to see myself as the same person than it is to see myself as changing into different people over time. Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think really that's just the intuitive way to see ourselves. No one, because no one really has to study philosophy to look back at themselves at 10 years old and say, yeah, that was me that went to that elementary school. When I look back, I played clarinet in the band at Webster Elementary, or I had Mr. Overbay as my fifth grade teacher. These are just intuitive ways to
you too.
For us. Yeah, these are just intuitive ways for us to think about ourselves. And like you said, my mom never treated me like I was a different person from one day to the next. I was always the same person. She always saw me as the same person. Same with my dad and my siblings. It's just the intuitive way to think about ourselves. And a lot of philosophers try to come up with different ways of seeing ourselves, but I think they try to come up with a lot of counterintuitive things to explain a lot of counterintuitive ideas. G.K. Chesterton once said, "There's no idea so absurd that it hasn't been seriously defended by some philosopher." There are a lot of ideas that philosophers try to defend, and because they're trying to defend these ideas, which they think are true, they come up with these other counterintuitive ideas, which they say, because this idea I think is true, I believe is correct, then these counterintuitive ideas that I believe that I don't believe about myself must also be correct. So I should change my way of thinking about those instead of just thinking, well, maybe this view that I held is not correct because it leads me to absurd counterintuitive beliefs about myself as a self or as a collection of memories or whatever, or other absurd things that a philosopher might believe about himself. I've done work in bioethics, and of course there are philosophers who would say that that 2-month-old embryo in my mother's womb was not me. I didn't exist until 5 or 6 months in the womb, or I didn't exist until after I was an infant, because it would have been permissible to kill me as an infant because I wasn't a person at that point, or I didn't have a sense of self-awareness, so I really was not me at that point, so it would have been permissible to kill me at that point. So a lot of philosophers have these counterintuitive ideas, which is one reason why I think as much as I can admire a good philosopher, philosophy as a whole is not something I put a whole lot of stock in, just because a lot of very intelligent people can bring themselves to believe a lot of very unintelligent things.
That's good, man. I'm still that saying too. but no, I think you're absolutely right though. It's funny we're talking about this because I was just thinking recently. I love the rigor of good philosophical work. It's entertaining to me. I enjoy it, but I also value simplicity as well. Like at the end of the day, it's with this person saying livable. Like, is it really plausible? In terms of how we would live that out. And when I think about it. I'm kind of being funny, but I mean, can you imagine, trying to get over on your parents? Like, say you broke that vase or something like that, and, yesterday, and you try to get over on them and say, oh, well, no, actually, technically, it wasn't me. I've had a different set of experiences since then. I'm,
right.
There's a different sum total of who I am. So, I'm sorry, you missed your opportunity to
to punish the person responsible. Yeah.
Right. I'm not the person responsible. Exactly.
Yeah.
So I don't think that would have went over too well. Not in the Coleman household anyway. I'm pretty sure I wouldn't have got away with that. So on the one hand, I can appreciate well-argued, points and things like that. But at the same time, it's like, when it comes down to brass tacks, so to speak, as my grandma used to say, can you really live that out? And is that really how the human experience tends to go? And I think, Clinton, you brought up a great point. But I think grounds this is something. It's not just kind of like highfalutin philosophical talk, but I mean, these things are consequential. When you think about like abortion, for example, or maybe on the other end of the spectrum, you may talk about like capital punishment or whatever. How you identify the self, what constitutes the self, and so forth. When you become a self, and all this kind of stuff. I mean, it certainly has real world and I would say deadly implications. Unfortunately, I'm thinking about abortion there. So, this stuff is not just something that we can kind of just argue our way out of. I think, we really need to ground these things in something more substantive than just, high sounding cymbals and tinkling brass, if you will.
Yeah, and Adam brought up some really good points too, in that talking about breaking a vase and arguing you're not responsible to your parents, but our system of law is built upon the assumption that we are ourselves throughout our entire lives, because you have to assume that the person the police officer arrests is the same person who goes into court for the trial and the sentencing. And if they committed a murder or something and you sentence them to life in prison, you're also assuming that they're going to remain the same individual who was responsible for that murder throughout their entire life. Otherwise life imprisonment would not be just, because you're going to be punishing someone not responsible for the crime by for jail time. So that whole idea that that our law system is based on that, and also that we need to hold views that are livable. I think of C.S. Lewis when he talks about moral relativists, and he says, a moral relativist will always complain if you cut in front of him in line or if you steal his apple. So moral relativism might sound good to a philosopher, or to some. Well, actually, most philosophers, I think, reject moral relativism, but it might sound good to many people, who don't want to be responsible for their actions, or who just think that there's no real objective way of grounding morality. But in reality, no one can consistently live as a moral relativist. So making sure your ideas are livable is also of paramount importance too. So I thought Adam's brought up some good points there too.
Yeah, and so both of you guys touched on something else. When we think of ourselves as a continuum, it's not just that I am now the same person that I was, but I will continue to be the same person that I am. The self as continuum doesn't just project back into the past, but we project ourselves into the future. And that relates to the law system that you're talking about, that when I condemn this criminal now, I'm condemning him for 10 years to life or whatever it is, because he is still going to be the same person responsible for that crime 10 years from now. And that relates to the abortion issue as well, because once this person is conceived, they will continue to be a person into the future. And so, the act of aborting them now will have consequences upon this person's future, because we project personhood into the future. Sometimes.
It's interesting there, Joel, too. I haven't really thought about it till just now, but I think in the, this might be an overstatement, but I guess in what I deem to be like the really important, or I guess the aspects of philosophy that are pertinent to everyday life, if you will. I'll just put it that way. Maybe I can clean that up later. But I feel like a lot of these issues kind of intersect, and I'm kind of wondering what you just said about that continuum person is not just who you were in terms of who you are, but also who you are and who you will be. I think about like the development of character. If it is indeed the case that I'm going to be a different person, like literally a different person tomorrow, than I am today, then the idea of character development seems to me kind of goes out of the window, because there's just different people who are like kind of, different slices, if you will, from one, point in time to another, versus a continuum where you have an individual who is maybe more wise morally, than they were yesterday, having had some experiences and learned from them and grown in a certain way. That being said, I think that character development, or what some theologians will call soul building, is intimately tied with answering or making sense of the problem of evil. If it is the case that God is interested in individuals who are developed in character, such that they can go into some sort of eternity where they're entrusted with, whatever it may be that He wants to entrust them with, and they have the wherewithal to be able to handle it, from a moral standpoint, then the suffering of this life isn't in vain. There's something to suffering that ties in with soul building or character development that has eternal consequence and eternal value, right? But I think if you take this other mode where we're just, again, like these, I can't even say we, but you just have these slices of people from time to time, then I think that takes character development out of the window and leaves us with one less peg with which to engage the problem of evil, I think.
Yeah, and that's a really interesting point if we take a God's eye view on it, because does God see me in cross sections across time? Like does God see me now as I am now, and perhaps like the history building up to this moment? Or does God see me as a continuum? Does He see me throughout my life from beginning to end to eternity, if such a thing is? And does He judge me as a continuum or as a slice, if you will, a cross section? And it's interesting. My wife was having this difficulty with somebody she was discussing, and they brought up a verse in, I want to say Jeremiah, where it says that, the old things will be remembered no more. And, her friend was telling her, well, this means that we won't remember our families in heaven or something like that, or your father who's in heaven doesn't remember you now because the old things are no longer remembered. And so if you take that passage and actually like read the passage instead of just the verse, it's God begins by sort of listing the crimes of the people. And He says that, your crimes are always before me, and you're judged according to them. And then He talks about this new world where the lion will lay down with the lamb, etc. And He says, as He's talking about this new world, He says, and the things that were will no longer be remembered. And it's clear, if you take that into context, that He's talking about your sins.
Right.
This is a demonstration of His grace. He no longer remembers you according to your sins.
Yeah, it's like Ray Coco says, never read a Bible verse.
Yeah, exactly.
Right.
Yeah.
But yeah, no, I mean, it's this whole idea of, does God see me as a continuum? And if he does, how does that affect his perspective of me and, any future judgment that may occur?
And actually, that ties into something Clinton said too. He was talking about this notion of justice. You kind of take this continuum mode, kind of goes out the window, because how do you judge a guy who, maybe there's no statute of limitations on murder, but nevertheless, he's a different guy. So now you can't get him, that sort of thing. But I think, to your point, Joe, eternally, it seems like you run into a problem there too. Like, which slice of what we call Adam Coleman does God judge for eternal damnation or eternal life, right? How does God do that? God's ability to make a judgment, if we're to take this model, it seems to me that would have to go out of the window as well,
Yeah, it's all a good point. And I'm going to talk about future selves here in just a second, which relates to the continuum idea. So this means, who am I going to be in the future? And there's two ways that this question goes in cognitive psychology. There's a self that I wish to become, known as the possible self, and a person that I really don't want to become, which is known as the feared self. Now, I really don't want to become a world-conquering supervillain, but I also don't fear becoming that because it's not in the realm of possibility. I also don't want to become an old, lonely man with dementia, but that's a definite possibility, so that could very well be a feared self for me. I could look into the future and kind of see me as that person, and it's within the realm of possibility, so it's something I fear becoming. Now, that doesn't mean that we never want to grow or change, but we want to grow and change in ways that reflect our goals and values as they currently are. So a teenage drama club member wouldn't mind becoming a world famous actress because this aligns with the things she already values, but she's afraid of becoming just another soccer mom because this would reflect a failure and a rut she might get stuck in. So in terms of future selves as kind of a concept, what do you guys think?
Not really a whole lot to add here. I mean, as Christians who believe in a soul, that transcends time and all of our personal experiences and memories and things, there are things that we fear becoming as well. And so I think that this is, a point of common ground we could have with these psychologists is, knowing that there are certain things in the future which are within our which are within our control. Then there are things which are not within our control, and then of course, like you said about becoming a world-ending supervillain, there are things that really are not possibilities for us to become, as much as we might wish for them. I personally wish I could go gallivanting around the stars with Captain Picard on the Enterprise, but that's unfortunately
not Captain Kirk.
Well, no. I mean, Kirk is great, but Picard is my preferred captain. Using this as kind of a tongue-in-cheek example. My point being that I wish I could, travel among the stars in a starship and go explore what's out there, but that's never going to be a possibility for me. So it's not something that I can look forward to, or it's not something that I can fear missing out on because it's just not going to be a possibility in any sense. So yeah, I think that, I personally think that there's a lot of common ground here that we can find.
That's an interesting thought, because if we bring that back into the Christian worldview, there's this possible self, the person I want to become, and there's this feared self, the one I don't want to become. And kind of built into the Christian worldview is that there is a possible self that I absolutely will become. There is this sort of ideal self that I am in Christ, that God can more or less guarantee me if I am to enter into that relationship. So, in the Christian worldview, whether or not you buy the worldview, there's kind of this healthy mental health thing that, in the Christian worldview, I can absolutely guarantee that I will become my potential self, my possible self, the person I want to be, versus, say, Hinduism, where I'm going to be endlessly recycled, and maybe or maybe not I'll hit it right one of these days, but there's always this possibility of endless failure. And other types of religion will, you really have to work to become this possible self, because if you don't put in the hard work and become the self that God wants you to be, then you're out. And the Christian worldview guarantees you that you will become this possible self, this idealized self, as long as your ideal self aligns with the self that God wants you to be, right?
Yeah, grace, and then the sanctifying work of the Holy Spirit. I think of that scripture. He who began a good work in you will complete it until the day of Jesus Christ. That's definitely something that can bolster, one's confidence that they're going to reach that ideal self, and then I guess lessen the fear that you won't reach, or that you'll be something else or whatever, But yeah, without those resources, I can imagine how that could be pretty daunting to have this idea of what you should be, and yet, be either incapable of attaining it or just kind of really have no real expectation of ever attaining it. That's kind of deep, actually. I never thought about that.
Yeah, neither did I. That's why I love these discussions.
You're a genius, man. That's all there is to it.
All right. So we were talking about the psychologist Thagard, who came up with this level of explanation view. And he talked about the social self and the individual self. So there's basically two extremes to the social and individual selves. On the one extreme, your social self is determined for you by the family into which you were born, your position in society, your career. These things are set for you, and there's little or no latitude for you to move outside of this social realm. I know this sounds bleak, but there are societies wherein this is seen as a good thing. You know your place, and you take pride in living up to the expectations and duties that your social position determines for you. There's some comfort in that because there's stability. I am who I am. Everybody knows who I am. I just have to be the best me that I can be in this position. On the other extreme, you have the culture in which a person is a rugged individual, and being tied to family, economic status, career, or any other social position is seen as oppressive and a denial of your individualism. So in this scenario, you tell everyone else how they need to see you. You carve out your own social identity and you insist it on everyone around you. Now, bear in mind, very few people fall on one extreme or the other. Most people sit somewhere in between total collectivism, you're just a cog in a social machine, or total individualism. I say who I am, and you better respect. Any thoughts on social and individual selves?
Yeah, I think it's interesting because, we'll get to this at a different point, but I think that the biblical worldview strikes a nice balance between the two, where you don't have the individual expunged, in terms of importance, but at the same time, the individual is not all important, so I think it strikes a nice balance there, but I know we'll probably get back to that at some point.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think balance is important. And there's almost no culture in the world that's like absolute extreme one way or another. In classical sort of sociology, we like to talk about the West and the East, where in the West, we're all individualistic, rugged individuals. And in the East, it's all collectivism. You're beholden to your government and family and so forth. And, in reality, that's really not the case. I mean, cultures tend to be somewhere in between on issues.
Yeah, here in the United States specifically, you'll find both of those ideas expressed. So it's not like our culture is necessarily one or the other, but you'll find people who can hold to either one to some degree, whether it be to an extreme or to a lesser extent.
I think, and this may just be me talking out of my head, but I think that in the US, we treat it more like a smorgasbord where we pick and choose which parts of our identity are tied to our society and which parts are, we define. And that almost might be part of defining our identity because, I guess I belong to this category and I like belonging to this category. So I'm going to take that off the board, put it on my tray. And I don't like belonging to this category. So I'm going to take that off my tray and insist that everybody treat me differently, so it's kind of a pick and choose versus being forced to kind of step up and be a rugged individual, or being forced to step back and let everybody define who you are for yourself.
Yeah, because even here in the United States, we'll say that there's a sense in which we're each born into our station. If you're born into a poor family, then that's going to obviously affect the experiences and the opportunities that you have in your life. If you're born into a rich family, that's going to affect what opportunities and experiences you have. But the way that the American system is set up, or at least if it's running the way that that our founders wanted it to, being born in a particular station is not necessarily just a life sentence into that station. We have ways to where someone who's born into a poor family, if they're sufficiently motivated, can get out of their poor station in life and become middle class or even wealthy, depending on what kinds of ideas they have, their motivation and their ingenuity. 'Cause there are a lot. We can point to a number of people who what they call like the rags to riches story. We can point to a number of people who started out poor or in not well off situation, and because of some idea they had, they implemented it, and because of their ingenuity, were able to get themselves into a position where they were wealthier. And so, so here in the United States, we kind of have both, where we have people who believe that whatever station you're born into, that's just kind of your lot in life. You have to just make the best of it, or whatever your lot in life, certain decisions that you make, you can be poor, make good decisions, and become wealthy with proper ingenuity. Or if you're wealthy, you can make really poor decisions and lose the wealth that you have, whether you were born into it or whether you earned it through hard work, that kind of thing. So I think America would be more like you were saying, Joel, more like a smorgasbord of ideas, because we have people, who believe your lot in life is your lot in life. We have people who believe, I'm not defined by the situation I'm born into. Let me tell you how you should see me, that kind of thing. We have a wide variety of ideas within Americans, I would say.
Yeah, I would more or less agree. All right, so I'm going to briefly touch on imposter syndromes. This is the idea that, the me that everybody else sees is not the me that I see. And everybody else thinks I'm better than I think that I myself am. So in this particular situation, you think everybody's got a good opinion of you and overestimates you, and you feel like you're unworthy of respect or esteem. And I want to connect that to another part of the debate, which is transhumanism. So the debate is, if we get to the point in society where we can modify ourselves genetically or technologically, does this change who we are? Does it affect our, quote, selves? To answer that, yeah, you could look at a similar phenomena that we actually have already, and that's the use of steroids and cosmetic surgery to change ourselves. As it happens, we have studies on both of these, and both of these are ways we can achieve a possible self that we talked about, a future self. That is, I see a future in which I'm a bodybuilder or an athlete, so I use hormones to make that happen. Or I see a future in which I'm a ladies' man, so I change my appearance to make that happen. It might also be a way of coping with imposter syndrome, which I just mentioned, because I can become the person that people already think I am. So I can just try to live up to everybody else's expectations of me. But does it work? Studies say not really. It shows that the use of steroids or cosmetic surgery doesn't really increase a person's self-esteem or self-image, and can sometimes even damage it. Whereas putting in the actual work to improve yourself, like working out or studying to get smarter, actually improves your self-image.
Yeah, I can kind of see why that would be. Because like if you were to go in for plastic surgery, or like, say go in for like to get surgery to have you lose weight, as opposed to just working out, can actually kind of maybe feel like you're putting a Band-Aid over the problem, but you haven't really addressed the actual root of why you were that way. So I can kind of see why that might make the problem even worse, because you feel like you're taking the easy way out, or cheating your way out of making yourself a better person.
Yeah, and that might actually contribute to imposter syndrome, right?
Right, yeah.
All right, so that's pretty much the wrap on that. I'll wrap it up by saying that, this relates to transhumanism in a way, because we can kind of look from these studies on cosmetic surgery and steroid use to kind of look forward in the future. What would it be like if I could use technology to increase my intelligence, or if I could, upload myself to a computer, or, genetically engineer myself to be stronger? It would essentially be the same as what we're talking about with cosmetic surgery and steroids. It's an artificial means of enhancing myself that I can't really take credit for.
Well, it's kind of like, I'm going to be super corny here, like the Avengers movie, man. If I could be Ultron, somehow, I could recreate myself. I'm like Ultron all of a sudden. It seemed like he had a lot of problems. Like he still didn't seem too self-fulfilled there. You know what I mean? So I don't know if our problems are eradicated by, those kind of changes.
If you're going to compare it to the Avengers, a really good comparison would be Captain America, because he starts out as this wimpy, skinny guy who
there you go. Okay.
Couldn't live up to any kind of potential, but his self, if you will, this character that the scientists saw in him when they selected him, was bigger than his physical self, and so they were just sort of making his outside self match his inside self, if you will.
Indeed. Yeah. All right.
So that's the conversation on the self, and we'll come back for a part 2 when Adam's going to give us a little presentation on, who are we, from the biblical or the Christian perspective.
Dimensionables.org